In the United States, the leading cause of death for pregnant people is homicide. For Black pregnant people like our victim today, the homicide rate is 4 times the national average. 24-year-old D'Lisa Kelley left her grandmother's home in Dallas on March 7, 2014, to attend the wake of a friend. She would never make it back home. A week after she was last seen alive, her body was found in front of an abandoned house across town. Despite having security camera footage, a description of the vehicle D'Lisa was last seen entering, and an accidental phone call during what was probably the attack that ended her life. During what sounded like an attack, this case is still unsolved 11 years after the fact.
Hello, and welcome to Box in the Basement podcast. I'm your host, Arlene.
And I'm Leah.
In the last 50 years, the U.S. has had nearly 1 million homicides, and since then, over 250,000 cases sit in a box in a basement where all hopes for justice go to die. In 1996, someone shot my uncle Leon Laurelis, changing my life forever and leaving a devastating hole in my heart, and his case remains unsolved. Join me and my wife, Leah, as we shed light on these forgotten victims, their life, the loved ones they left behind, the evidence, and the theories of who committed these crimes, leaving communities in fear and leaving families without answers. Support our effort to change the justice system through the Homicide Families Victims' Rights Act, as we hope to make a difference with our audience as we remember the victims and demand justice. In 1996, my world was shattered when my uncle Leon Laurelis was shot execution-style in a small town in Texas. To this day, his murder remains unsolved, and the pain of that injustice continues to haunt me, my family, and Leon's friends and co-workers. Here at Box in the Basement, we want to shed light on the overwhelming number of unsolved murders and disappearances here in Texas and beyond. We want to bring awareness to the lesser-known cases that got little to no attention, in hopes that someone listening will come forward with any information, because we strongly believe all lives matter. Ultimately, we want to get justice for Leon and for all the victims whose cases are sitting, collecting dust in a box in a basement. Please note that this episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement podcast and Justice for Leon Laurelis. And now you can also find us on YouTube.
And 2014 was a year in terms of international news. Outbreak of Ebola in West Africa dominated the news cycle for a hot minute. Malaysia Airlines had a particularly bad year as Flight 17 was shot down over Ukraine and Flight 370 mysteriously disappeared on its route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. ISIS captured a significant amount of territory in Iraq and Syria. The Seattle Seahawks beat the Denver Broncos in the Super Bowl. The LA Kings beat the New York Rangers for the Stanley Cup. The San Antonio Spurs beat the Miami Heat in the NBA Finals, and the San Francisco Giants defeated the Kansas City Royals in the World Series. The week of March 7th, 2014, Katy Perry's Dark Horse topped the Billboard Hot 100, and Cole Swindell topped the country charts with Chillin' It. Guardians of the Galaxy was the top grossing film of the year. Skinny Jeans reached peak popularity. Kim and Kanye got married. Jimmy Fallon took over The Tonight Show. Bill Cosby was outed as a predator. And the Ice Bucket Challenge took over social media. And I see it's trending again now. We've covered Dallas in previous episodes, so we'll hit the highlights here. As with 99% of the cities and towns we cover on this podcast, Dallas grew up around a railroad in the mid 19th century and later flourished as the oil industry boomed. Dallas's population sits at just over 1.3 million today, and it would have been just slightly lower in 2014. The city is home to one of the largest urban arts districts in the country and hosts the State Fair of Texas every year. The city is home to a number of major corporate headquarters, including AT&T, Southwest Airlines, Jacobs Engineering, and Dean Foods. D'Lisa Kelley was born July 24th, 1989 in Dallas, Texas, and unfortunately we don't have a ton of information on her life. We do know that she had a young son at the time of her death, and she had also recently learned she was pregnant again. By all accounts, she was a great mom who was totally devoted to her little boy. According to her friends and family, she was absolutely thrilled at the prospect of having a second child, and she was looking forward to starting this next chapter of her life. Then tragedy struck. Just as she was beginning to process and plan for her new arrival, one of D'Lisa's closest friends was killed in a car accident in early March 2014. D'Lisa was only 24 herself, so I'm assuming that her friend was probably close to her age. That's a tough time to lose someone in your support system, and the death of a 20-something is always rough. You're just getting started in life. On March 7th, 2014, D'Lisa steeled herself for what was probably one of the most difficult things she'd had to deal with in her young life. She got up, got dressed, did her normal daily tasks, and left her grandmother's house that afternoon sometime between 4:30 and 5:30 with the intention of attending her best friend's wake. D'Lisa didn't have a car at the time of her disappearance. She had planned on either catching a bus or finding a ride that fateful day in March. D'Lisa's family seemed to think she was doing reasonably well at the time. While she was obviously devastated at the loss of her friend, nothing seemed out of sorts with her otherwise. No new friends or romantic interests. She wasn't acting strangely or doing things outside of her normal routine. So nobody really felt anything other than sorrow and sympathy for D'Lisa when she left her grandmother's house that day. At around 6:45 p.m., D'Lisa's sister Jasmine got a bone-chilling, unintentional phone call, a pocket dial, if you will, from D'Lisa's number. Jasmine heard a disturbance in the background. A woman is yelling, and a man can be heard demanding the woman to stop. The woman on the call, assumed to be D'Lisa herself, can be heard screaming, "Stop, stop, get off me." And the man in the background replied with, quote, "Shut up, stop screaming, you want to be hard-headed," end quote. D'Lisa's sister attempted to call her back repeatedly but never got through. She got a text message from D'Lisa's phone at around 7 p.m. that simply said, quote, "Call you in a minute," end quote. But no call ever came. D'Lisa's grandmother called 911 later that evening, but her concerns were dismissed by the responding law enforcement officer, Sergeant Kevin Mansell, who refused to classify her as missing and who made some inappropriate remarks to the dispatcher and even chuckled at the situation. You can find the recording of this conversation with the sergeant online if you're interested. And let me clarify here that the police were aware of that scary pocket dial phone call to Jasmine and the repeated attempts to get a hold of her. Jasmine called 911 again the following day after D'Lisa failed to return home the prior evening, and nobody could get through to her. This time, the responding officers did take what is called a want to locate report. Later that day, D'Lisa's boyfriend at the time made contact with a detective in the missing persons unit at Dallas PD to provide his contact information. The case had not yet been assigned to the missing persons unit, so I'm assuming here the boyfriend was just being proactive. The case wasn't actually assigned to the missing persons unit until the afternoon of Sunday, March 9th, 2 whole days after D'Lisa went missing. Suddenly, police seemed to realize that this was a serious situation. You have a young woman with a 2-year-old child at home who she'd never been separated from for more than 24 hours in the past. You had a disturbing phone call that made it sound like D'Lisa was in imminent danger. And you had the fact that nobody could get through to her and that she never came home. I know lots of people find stuff like this frustrating and infuriating. Yes, I know that law enforcement gets tons of phone calls about people who are habitual runaways, or they get calls that turn out to be false alarms. But this woman, from everything I've been able to find, was kind of a homebody. She was a full-time mom to her toddler son. It wasn't like her to be off running around with no contact for days at a time. She didn't even have her own car, so it would have been logistically difficult to do that anyway. Families know when things are off. So while I see law enforcement's perspective here, it's extremely frustrating to see this family like, hey, we know this person, she's our family, and this is completely out of the ordinary. We're concerned, and to see that just brushed off. Especially when you take into account the phone call where D'Lisa is heard screaming at a man who is telling her to shut up. So on Sunday afternoon, an endangered person bulletin was sent out and the investigation formally began. An initial look at the call log from D'Lisa's phone didn't really tell detectives much, other than there was no new information on the phone's location since Friday. So basically, they just couldn't triangulate the phone's current location. That's essentially what that means. Law enforcement never actually went in person to speak to D'Lisa's family until Monday, March 10th. And it wasn't even a detective that went to speak to her, it was a patrol officer. In the following days, investigators got at least one anonymous tip saying that D'Lisa was spotted at a convenience store right near her home sometime between 5:30 and 6 p.m. on the day she went missing, so March 7th. Detectives tried to get the security camera footage from the gas station on Thursday, March 13th, but they were unsuccessful initially. On Friday, March 14th, D'Lisa's family, frustrated with the way law enforcement was handling the situation, decided to take matters into their own hands. They organized a small volunteer search party and were preparing to go out on foot when D'Lisa's mother, Lysandra, got a call from Jasmine. Police had gotten a phone call earlier that day about human remains being found on the front porch of an abandoned home in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas. The family's worst fears were confirmed when the body was identified as 24-year-old D'Lisa Kelley. The medical examiner determined her cause of death was blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. She had been beaten severely. There were cuts and bruises all over her body, and her jawbone had been shattered. The ME also determined that D'Lisa had only been dead around 3 days by the time her body was found, which means she was likely alive for around 4 days after she left her home on March 7th. So now investigators were left with the task of organizing a timeline and trying to trace D'Lisa's movements, but they unfortunately didn't get a lot of information from her cell phone or from any interviews they conducted in the early days of the investigation. They did eventually get that security footage from the gas station, however, and sure enough, D'Lisa Kelley can be seen with a male companion at a Stop and Save store on the corner of Sunnyvale Road and Overton Road in Dallas at 6:13 p.m. on the evening of March 7th. She exits the building and can be seen speaking to a young man in a blue 1986 Mercury Grand Marquis. D'Lisa then got into the car, which was parked next to a Dallas PD cruiser, incidentally, and the pair drove off. The man in the blue Mercury was never publicly named as a suspect, and whoever he is, he's never been arrested or charged in connection with D'Lisa's disappearance or death. Nobody has. And unfortunately, that's where we are today. Police have run out of leads. The case is cold. So, what happened to D'Lisa Kelley on the evening of March 7th, 2014? It's a matter of who and where in this case, I'm afraid. Though some of the details on the timeline of March 7th are a little unclear, like we don't know exactly what time D'Lisa left her grandmother's house for the wake that afternoon. It was sometime between 4:30 and 5:30 p.m. The fact that she shows up on a nearby convenience store's security camera footage at just after 6 p.m. leads me to believe she probably left home closer to 5:30 p.m. We know D'Lisa didn't have her own car at the time, so it's likely she was looking for a ride to her friend's wake. She lived in the neighborhood, so she was probably known at this corner store as her family described it. Maybe she felt safe enough to grab a ride from a regular or an employee or something. Maybe she'd arranged to meet a friend for a ride. Unfortunately, we just don't know. I used to live about a half a block from a convenience store when I was single and in my 20s. I knew all the regulars at the store. I'd walk there all the time to grab a soda or a burger or whatever. The guy on swing shift and I were on a first name basis. He actually offered to drive me to the ER once when I was sick as a dog with food poisoning and went in for a bottle of Pepto. I know we like to think that people are shitty and uncaring these days, but sometimes folks in the corner store are the ones who have your back. I have a feeling that's who placed the anonymous phone call to police telling them to check the security cameras in the first place. My personal belief is that D'Lisa met up with the person who took her life at that store, because we know she never actually made it to her friend's wake. I don't think we mentioned that earlier, but she never showed up. She left her grandmother's home and she never made it to her intended destination. So whatever happened to her as a result of her trip to the convenience store. I'm sure there are other possible explanations, but this seems like the most likely sequence of events here. She walked to the store, she met up with someone, could have been someone she knew or was familiar with, and it could have easily been a complete stranger. And then things took a wrong turn, and D'Lisa ended up the victim of some disgusting predator in one way or another. She left the store at around a quarter after 6 p.m. that day, and then she pocket dialed her sister just 30 minutes later. The timeline doesn't leave much room for interpretation here, even though police have never identified the man D'Lisa is seen leaving the convenience store with as a suspect. If she had made it to her friend's wake, then I'd have some more questions. But this is just too tight of a timeline for me. If it wasn't the person who picked her up at the convenience store or someone in the car with them, then it had to be someone close by. Did she get dropped off at another corner somewhere and try to hitch another ride to the wake? I'm not so sure about that. It's obviously a possibility, and in order to cover our bases legally speaking, we do need to consider it. As we mentioned in the opening, homicide is the leading cause of death for pregnant people in the United States. Many times it's at the hands of a partner or ex-partner, and I considered that possibility when researching here, especially given the verbiage used by the person we're assuming was her attacker on the other end of that phone call. He said, "You want to be hard-headed." That suggests a level of familiarity to me, but I haven't seen any reports that D'Lisa's sister recognized the man's voice or had any concerns about her boyfriend at the time. And we do know that he's never been named publicly as a suspect either, and all other leads have gone cold. So it's not looking like that's the answer here, but we just don't know. The most frustrating part of this case for me is the delay in responding to D'Lisa's disappearance on the part of law enforcement. As we mentioned earlier, we totally understand that police get a bazillion phone calls every day about people who aren't actually missing. False alarms, habitual runaways. But D'Lisa was not a habitual runaway. She was young, pregnant, and had a young son at home. She wasn't leaving to go party or travel. She was leaving her grandmother's house to go to her best friend's wake. And her sister got a phone call that made it sound like D'Lisa was in serious trouble. The fact that the officer initially contacted by dispatch basically dismissed the family's complaint really pisses me off. Joking around with the dispatcher about the woman who's missing? Unacceptable. And I say this as someone whose professional communications have been monitored for almost 25 years. This is a 24-year-old pregnant woman with a toddler at home. She had no priors, no history of running away, nothing. If your job has jaded you to the point where you're cracking jokes at the expense of endangered missing individuals, get therapy or get a new job. Come at me, I don't care at this point. The sergeant that took that initial call is apparently no stranger to controversy either. 2 years after D'Lisa's murder, Sergeant Mansell was dispatched to the home of Tony Timpa, who called emergency services after experiencing distress after discontinuing his medication and using cocaine. Mansell arrived to Tony Timpa's residence to find him already restrained by private security. A struggle ensued, though I'm not sure exactly how much of a struggle this was, given that Tony Timpa was incapacitated by drugs and restrained by the time he got there, and video showed other officers at the scene had him pinned to the ground for over 11 minutes. It's very obvious that the man was struggling to breathe. In any case, Tony Timpa ended up dead. Tony's death ended up being attributed to cardiac arrest due to drug use and physical restraint, and Mansell and 2 other officers were eventually indicted for his death. It was some bullshit charge. I can't remember exactly what it was. D'Lisa's family ended up suing the Dallas Police Department about 4 years after D'Lisa's murder, asserting that if their concerns had been taken seriously from the start, D'Lisa would still be alive today. And it's honestly not hard to come to that same conclusion when you consider all the facts of the case. D'Lisa was not a habitual runaway. She was not a troublemaker. She lived with her family and had a young son that everyone said she was totally devoted to. She didn't stay away from home. She had a steady boyfriend. And the most infuriating thing to me is that the matter wasn't taken seriously despite her sister having heard screaming, yelling, and struggling on the other end of a pocket dial phone call. If all of that together doesn't make you sit up and take notice, what will? I don't know the outcome of that lawsuit, though. I haven't been able to find anything else on it. D'Lisa's family has never stopped advocating for her, though, and they've been pushing for a law that mandates police response to missing persons cases when that person is thought to be in imminent danger. It's called a Kelley alert, much like an Amber alert or a Silver alert. Keep in mind that the medical examiner estimated that D'Lisa was alive for at least 4 days after she disappeared. While we can play what if all day, the fact that she was clearly held alive somewhere for days while the police essentially sat on their hands should make even the most cynical among us ask some questions. If you have any information regarding the kidnapping and murder of D'Lisa Kelley in March of 2014 in Dallas, Texas, please contact the Dallas Police Department's Homicide Unit at 214-671-3632.
Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, host, and guest. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, host, and guest. If you or someone you know is a victim of crime, support is available. Call 855-4-VICTIM to speak with someone who can help you understand your rights and options. Visit victimconnect.org to learn more. We are excited to announce that we are now a part of the Darkcast Network. Darkcast Network, the best in indie podcasts. Check out all the great shows at darkcastnetwork.com. If you think bringing unsolved cases is important, then please take a moment to rate and review our podcast. Also, please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement podcasts and Justice for Leon Laurelis. You can now also find us on YouTube. If you like what you hear, please do us a favor and subscribe. It would help so much, my lovelies. Also, please share this episode so we can bring awareness to these lesser-known cases so we can reach more people in hopes that someone who may know something will come forward. I'd also like to ask that you sign my petition for my Uncle Leon Laurelis' case to be reopened and reviewed with fresh eyes. And you can find our petition on change.org. This podcast has a bigger purpose than just providing information and entertainment. The Homicide Victims' Families' Rights Act is a bipartisan bill that was signed into law by Congress in 2021, and we want to see it put into action. This law establishes a systematic process for reviewing case files related to cold case murders. The focus is on providing a mechanism for the families and friends of murder victims to request a formal review of such cases. I also have a GoFundMe page to hire an attorney to help me get a copy of his autopsy that I have been denied for 27 years. You can find the GoFundMe by searching for Leon Laurelis. That's Laureles. But to get his body exhumed, to search for evidence that was not collected the first time around. We and other families and friends need assistance with getting FOIA requests. It blows our minds that so many murders occurred from 1976 to 1997 in Brownwood, Texas, under the watch of the same investigators responsible for handling Leon's case. We're going to look at all the unsolved murders in Brownwood, and maybe even a few solved ones if it helps uncover what was happening in that era that left so many families devastated and a community living in fear. Thank you for joining us. Be kind. Later, Gators.